a slide on the screen, and please would you sit in front of your photograph as it were, and then we'll have the conversation get started. First, we invite Nakampe Mulelwa, the Chief Executive Officer, NBA Africa. And then, of course, our former Deputy President, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. You saw him a little earlier on, David Pilling, the Africa editor for the Financial Times. And finally, Dr. Same Mdluli. Thank you very much. Please have a seat. I've enjoyed setting the scene for many of our conversations in terms of just the context of what is unfolding on the continent and perhaps even the history of where we come from. And I thought to really get us going, let me highlight some achievements that we often take for granted that are homegrown. Because I think we don't often tell the story of how much Africa has been finding solutions to the problems the world perhaps hasn't even awoken to. Take M-Pesa, for example. Kenyans leveraged the high mobile phone access in their country to skip the use of traditional bank accounts. In March 2007, after being launched by Safaricom, M-Pesa quickly captured a significant market share for cash transfers and grew to 17 million subscribers by December 2011, and in Kenya alone, 60 million around the continent. The computed axial tomography scan, the CAT scan, was developed by two physicists here in Cape Town, and the two of them won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, and it's now used around the world. There are 375 million CAT scans that are performed worldwide each year. The speed gun, now widely used in the world of sport to measure everything from the pace of tennis serves or cricket ball deliveries, was made here on this continent. I can go on and on and on and on. So often the story of Africa is negative, but how about we change the perception and tell a positive story? So that's my scene setter. I'll start from that side for a change. Dr. Same, how do we rewrite the narrative of who we are on the global stage?
Well, thank you, Bongani. I think artists, African artists, have been doing this for a long time. We recently had a pop-up exhibition at our Rosebank offices of Dr. Esther Mahlangu, who you know is now a global icon. But it's also because I think what Mama Esther represents is not just, I think, her artistic practice in profiling African expressive modes. The Ndebele print is now recognizably a motif that's well known in the worldwide because of Mama Esther's work.
Did you see my neck piece last night?
No, I didn't. And so she represents that. I think her being on a global stage represents this idea of how an African artist has been able to shape the perception and create a very positive perception or a positive image of the continent. Similarly, you have young people like Laduma, I like using his example a lot in launching the Maxhosa brand. And the fact that he draws on a very specific Xhosa traditions of beadwork and beading and patterns around bead making from very specific region in the Eastern Cape. Everything from what Laduma does, from the production of the mohair that he uses in his luxury brand, is linked to his roots in South Africa and growing up in the Eastern Cape. But more so in drawing, I think, very specifically in indigenous knowledge practices that were taught to him by his mother his mother taught by his grandmother, and so it goes on. And so there are these, I think there's this aspect of indigenous knowledge systems that have always been around in how African artists have been creative or been using their creativity that is not necessarily profiled, and we need to start profiling that a lot more. Maxhosa, by the way, you remember a few years ago, there was a legal dispute he had with the fast fashion brand Zara on the pair of socks that, he felt were copied. And how he also, won that case was around even the pigments of colors that he uses in designs that are very specific to Africa. You cannot find them anywhere else, right? And that's what helped him, win that case, essentially. And for me, that always also, I think, always stands out at drawing from these indigenous knowledge practices that we need to draw on a little bit more.
All right. David, as a global journalist, no doubt you'd be familiar with often, I think, a fair resentment from many Africans about how our story is told by those from elsewhere. How do you balance what your audience and your readers require with what we may want to be told about ourselves?
Sure. Well, the first point I would make is I don't think you should worry too much. I mean, tell your own stories and tell your own stories to each other as well. You have several Nobel authors, for example. I read a lot of books. Abdulrazak Gurnah won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for literature. Wole Soyinka, of course, the first African, the first black person to win the Nobel Prize in literature. And if you go to a bookshop here, it's hard to find a Wole Soyinka book. Tell each other your stories would be one thing. I mean, this is not me shirking responsibility. If I'm thinking about what to write about, one of course has to balance. I think just to purely write good news stories does nobody any good. I'm bombarded with people asking me, why do we not write about the Sudan war more than we do? You're always writing about the war in Gaza, you're always writing about Ukraine. Doesn't an African life in Sudan count just as much? So one can be bombarded, and legitimately, I think, from the other side. Let me give you an example. There is a story in Kenya that literally I'm juggling now. One is about a company which is about to be bought by another company. It's what you might call a scoop. $70 million, $80 million transaction. By global standards, not very big, but it's an interesting story, and one could certainly weave a tale around it. I can't say exactly what sector it is because I'd be giving it away. On the other hand, you have Gen Z protesters in Nairobi right now and across Kenya who are representing another very real flourishing, you could argue, of African youth, of African protest, of civil society. They have been shot. 11 of them died this week. That is a bad news story in a sense. They've been killed. It's also, and one has to be careful how I word this on stage, but there is something positive about a youth movement in Kenya and indeed across Africa, I would argue. But just if you think about balancing those two stories, which do you tell? You probably only get the chance to tell one of those two stories. And you could criticize me for picking one over the other. It's a bit of a dilemma. So I think it's rather too easy to blame foreigners for kind of misstating the narrative. If you put yourself in the position, it's a complicated business. And even, this is just literally one tiny example from the last 24 hours that I'm giving you. Yeah. But you can just see how and there's 54 countries that we write about. Don't write about the continent, because Africa is a country. Africa is not a country, clearly. It is 54 countries. Yeah. So ought I be to writing about Malawi tomorrow? Ought I be to writing about Nigeria or South Africa? And what kind of story? Yeah. It's three-dimensional chess.
Dr. Ngcuka, there are so many positive stories, though, that are there. and it's tricky with you because you wear so many hats, for example, but I'm just thinking as a random sample, a 22 report by the African Development Bank says women now hold about 25% of parliamentary seats across the continent. Countries like Rwanda, for example, have 60% female representation in their national parliament. You, of course, being a former deputy president of this country, I mean, those kinds of strides being made by countries on the continent, surely those are worth celebrating, surely those are worth shouting out.
Indeed, and if you compare Africa with other countries in the world, we're not too shabby, but we are shabby. Because there's still a long way to go on the key issues that give meaning to gender equality. Representation is one, economic well-being is another, and not just women at the bottom of the pyramid, but ensuring that there is possibility for upward mobility from basic things like equal pay, which gives meaning. But also the fact that women in the media are not as prominent as you would like them to be, especially women who write, who shape, who lead newsrooms, who give meaning to content. So we can do more work there. But I would really argue with anybody who says that Africa, when it comes into representation of women, is the worst continent. We definitely are not the West. And this is a story that we have to build on. But we must also not become too celebratory, because we still have a lot of work to do.
All right, let's come to you, Nakampe. As CEO of NBA Africa, I mean, sport is certainly one way to tell the story of a place, culture maybe, if you will, particularly basketball. It also serves, I think, as a platform for entrepreneurship and even infrastructure development. How is that story being told?
Yeah, in various ways. If I think about what basketball is, so I came out of running Uber on the continent, so small nascent business, looked at some use cases, scaled up very quickly. If you look at basketball, fundamentals are not very different. It's a small business at the moment, been trying to figure out what is it that I do at basketball? Do I develop sports? I thought that was a job description. And then it evolved into, no, I'm actually running an entertainment and media company. And then it's now developed to, this is a big infrastructure play, a socioeconomic change maker that we could run on the continent. If we go into if we jump into some figures, in the first 4 seasons of basketball, $250 million that we've contributed to GDP on the continent. If we forecast that forward, we're looking at about $5.4 billion that we're looking to contribute on the continent through the sport. 37,000 jobs currently at the moment tied to the BAL, which is our Basketball Africa League. We fast forward that to 2034, we're looking at around 650,000 jobs. So super, super, super important to recognize this as a change agent on our continent. If we had to look at the soft power that basketball actually brings to the fore, right, is our media reach. This year, season 5 of the Basketball Africa League was broadcasting to more than 100 countries in 27 languages. Now that is an awesome, awesome, awesome platform where we showcase who we are as Africans, our capabilities, right? We start to tell stories on our own terms. And if you look at the cumulative viewing averages of the 5 seasons of the Basketball Africa League, it's 8 million viewers. And again, it's this reach that we suddenly have now to start defining who we are, right? We could have easily run basketball, NBA Africa from New York. We chose purposely not to do that, right? NBA Africa is a standalone entity that exists in Africa. It's staffed by Africans. It's run by Africans. and it's for Africans. And that was purposely done so that this narrative that we want to project to the rest of the world is told on our own terms.
Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka, you've obviously been a gender equality champion for a long time, and you say we're not too shabby, but we are still shabby. But how would elevating women's leadership contribute to transforming our story?
Well, if I just look at some of the issues that we discussed this morning that are important for Africa's economy, whether you are talking about tourism or infrastructure, the places where women have been, maybe not in significant number, but the far and few in between that have been there, that have played an outstanding role. I think it's important to tell their stories, to have them as role models, and also to make sure that, if I just think of an MBA class, I don't think that there's any gender context in teaching an MBA student. So they get out of the focus on how the economies are run by men. And that drives them. And that already sort of skews same way we're talking about algorithms. We skew the economies in such a way that the women become smaller and smaller. I think that it's a luxury for us in Africa or anywhere in the world not to utilize all the talent we have. I don't think that the world is run by the smartest men. Shame. And you can imagine how many clever women, as a result of this skewed attitude, are actually being left and are not able to play a role. So there's a lot in our attitude that I think we still need to manage in order to make sure that we make our economy work much better for all of us, not just for women, because one thing that is actually quite good about women is that when women are integrated in our economy, they are much more beneficiaries than they are men. Sorry, guys. Women can pull families out of serious problems, their communities, etc. So there's much value in the investment that we make on women. So imagine if both men and women had equal chances, how richer our countries would be.
But are there successes that perhaps readily come to mind? Let's take, for example, sustainability and inclusion. Are there African women voices contributing to the narrative on the global stage?
Yeah.
And how would that compare to women from elsewhere in the world?
I think of the late Wangari Maathai and the role that she played, not just in Kenya, but on the continent as well as on the global stage. She was equal to her peers, but she also made a big contribution in Kenya itself. I think of Vanessa in Chad, who is a pastoralist, who is now in global stages talking about the impact of climate change in the Sahel, and has helped to pull the Sahel out of the back and beyond, and helped to put it in the centers of power. We have Kanye here in South Africa, who has been very vocal about the issue of the extreme weather as we experience it in South Africa specifically. And of course, she is able to help people in other parts of the world appreciate how, when everything is gone, these women remain in their villages to pick up the pieces, and what that means for all of them. So Greta is not the only amazing climate, but there are more women like her, because the struggle for climate change in the world is led by young people and young women in particular. And in Africa, we see the same. It's particularly strong in East Africa.
David, let me go back to a point you made about the need for us to tell our stories ourselves. And I would ask, but is the world listening? I mean, we've seen, for example, the rise of digital platforms and African-led media. Are you seeing a shift in how there are opportunities there in telling the stories? And I'm going to use a silly example, but isn't the most successful TikToker an African?
Could be. Look, I mean, yes, I think it goes a little bit back to the discussion that we just had about AI, where, you know, it can go two ways, and two things can be true at the same time, by the way, and I think this is a slight problem with debate sometimes, that people can't hold two thoughts in their head at the same time. So contradiction is part of what we live. So with AI, for example, I mean, there is a danger, clearly, that in some ways it will leave Africa, some African economies behind, because it's all about capital and about, you know, universities and etc. In others, of course, it's the great leveler. You know, somebody sitting here in Cape Town or in Burundi or in, you know, Lagos, as indeed has been proved many a time, can plug into these global systems, and suddenly they're a global star, or they've contributed something globally. In that sense, you know, Tom Friedland, whose, you know, World is Flat, has been kind of ridiculed in a sense, but he was onto something. There is a flattening. There's also a huge amount of noise out there. So, for example, you can have, you know, massive social media chatter, let's call it, about, you know, pick any incident here on the continent, good, bad, or indifferent. And that can seem all-consuming, and people can imagine that this is somehow creating an impression out there in the world. It may be creating no impression, because, of course, people are living in their silos. They get what they want, they get what they plug in, and all of that chatter can never, ever break through. So I think these things can be double-edged. There was something I was just thinking about when you were talking, and literally I wasn't going to mention it, but, you know, this is the importance of narrative. And I'm going to say something that might contradict it later, but the importance of narrative. So, for example, the Constitution in South Africa, you know, this great kind of idea on a hill that came out of the struggle, the transition in 1994, these fantastic ideals that I think, you know, much of the world really bought into, and South Africa really bought into. Now, of course, anybody that's looking at this honestly will say, you know, there's been a great shortfall in many ways. You know, there's been great disappointments. But the idea of that the idea that the bricks of a prison were turned into the Supreme Court, the Constitution Hill, you know, these are symbols, they're stories, but they're important because, you know, during I would say the very difficult years that South Africa went through in the Zuma years, you know, you almost saw the institutions wobble, as I think you're seeing them wobble in America right now. But they sort of stood firm, you know, with some dishonorable exceptions, but they sort of stood firm, including, I would say, the media in South Africa. And partly it's because there is this idea out there, this narrative, this story on a hill, that is something that you people strive for. So I just wanted to throw that in as to why a narrative can be supremely important.
I think you make Dr. Phumzile's point quite well, because in both those examples, had the women led, perhaps we might have seen a different story, but I won't go there. Dr. Mguli, as a curator, one of the things that we have to grapple with is not only our narrative now, but perhaps even our past. In what ways do art institutions or maybe galleries position themselves, right, as catalysts for investment, for tourism, and even cultural diplomacy on the global stage, and tell a different story of what's unfolding?
Yeah. I mean, I think art institutions in general in Africa are, there's very little of them. And in South Africa, we have a very unique, I think, scenario where South Africa has over 300 museums. And all of those are, of course, part of our colonial legacy. And so it's about, I think, actively reimagining these spaces for ourselves, and that it then becomes a process of reclaiming, in a sense. But also, I think, introducing these spaces to communities and creating a sense of ownership, of re-owning this, and this reclamation that I'm talking about. That these spaces are there, and so how do we grapple with the kind of difficult pasts that they present and reimagine them for future generations? And that's where artists, I think, come in. Artists are great at reimagining or creating a sense of imagination of a future we want to see for all of us. And so I think it's about these art institutions as well being proactive about the kind of partnerships that we are intentional about, that start to create platforms for dialogue, for conversations, for transformation, for innovation, that then look at how we can reimagine ourselves. And I think that's something that we haven't quite gotten, because I think these institutions present a very difficult past that we haven't quite, even in artistic practice, I think artists themselves haven't found a way of grappling with the difficulties of the past that we have. Presenting art, how do you make art accessible to young people? And technology is one way. So it's about, I think, also using the tools that we have available. And it's not about kind of inserting these solutions and trying to force them to communities that may not identify with them, but about, I think, how do we use technology to better tell our stories? And these institutions become part of finding those solutions. Yeah.
But Nakampi, this is a story you will know well, but I'll share it with the room to illustrate. Kaman Molao, dreaming the impossible as he grew up walking the streets of Kawempe, which is a disadvantaged suburb in the outskirts of Uganda's capital, Kampala. And yet his dream became a reality in June as an 18-year-old. His name echoed at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn because he was announced as the 10th pick of the 2025 NBA draft. And it's a powerful story because his first game he played in Crocs?
Yep.
I'm told.
Wow.
Yep.
How many more of those stars are out there?
And this is the beauty, I think, about this game and this institution. I mean, Kaman is one bad example. And Kaman is a South Sudanese citizen. His family fled. I think he was 14 years old, and they moved to Uganda. And while walking out in the streets, an NBA scout happened to drive past him. 14 years old, 6'5". The car was put automatically in reverse. And the scout got out and said to the young man, "Have you ever considered playing basketball?" This is at 14 years old. And Kaman was like, "No," so they put a basketball in his hand. Kaman went through the NBA Academy, where he was drilled, he got an education. He then went through to go play in the Basketball Africa League, where he did brilliantly. Those of you who are basketball fans would have seen South Sudan game last year versus the American Dream Team, where South Sudan lost by 1 point. South Sudan almost put Steph Curry, LeBron James to shame.
Sure.
Right? They lost by 1 point. Kaman was central to that. He then goes off to Duke University, where he plays in the D1 league, which is the best league, university league. And then he gets picked 10th in the draft. Right? So these are the stories that are absolutely essential, but never get told, right? And Kaman is not the only one. Basketball fans would understand if you guys have heard of Pascal Siakam. Pascal Siakam plays for the Pacers. He played in the finals this year. He was instrumental in the Pacers making the finals. He won an NBA championship with the Raptors before. Pascal came out of the NBA Academy and the BAL Africa League. We have Joel Embiid, who's Cameroonian. Again, young child discovered, huge monster of a guy, 7'2" now. Right? Who was also found, have you ever played basketball? And put a basketball handle, I think, in his hand. He was MVP in the NBA. If you look at the NBA right now, more than 50 players of African descent. Right? Some of the best players, Joakim Noah, who played hand in hand, for the Bulls, one of the best defensive players in the world. So again, there are these powerful narratives that sports has this exceptional ability to unearth. But again, because they come from this continent, and again, if Kaman was American and he had that sort of story, I'm telling you, probably 60, 70% of this room would know who Kaman Malwatch is.
Yeah.
You'd understand his story, his rags to riches. Oh my God, this kid, right? Because again, he is African. And again, because we haven't mastered this ability to tell our own stories on our own terms, those sort of stories fall through the cracks. And this is why this game of basketball is so beautiful, right? Outside of making these sort of stories, right, there are other touching stories where, we start building schools in South Sudan, or we start building basketball in South Sudan, where we have a very good partnership with Stanbic, by the way. Second year running a junior NBA, because we want to know how many more Kaman Malwatch can we unearth in these sort of markets. And this is the beautiful part of it.
Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka, I'm going to ask you to wear your other hat. One of the words that I think has been quite resonant throughout the day has been this word, opportunity. We've also acknowledged we're living in very uncertain and tumultuous times. Is there a role for African diplomacy to help the world shape itself differently in the near future?
Yeah. I just want to smuggle one thing to the bankers, and especially with Simi sitting in front of me. Please let our presidents in Africa know that you want to help them with money to finance meaningful projects in Africa, so that they don't have to go to some faraway country with a strong man and present us as beggars and risk giving in very important resources that we have, which we need for ourselves, for which we will have very bad terms if we go in that begging bowl, thinking that money can only be gotten if we cross the Atlantic. It is extremely frustrating to see that. So I'm just saying, as we tell our narrative, one of the narratives that is needed is that which communicates to our leaders about what Africa can offer them. I'm asking Standard Bank and other banks, convene our leaders and tell them that you can do it also here in Africa without taking their arm and a leg. After smuggling, what was the question?
You had to get that off your chest, I see.
It's been burning me.
I mean, I suppose it links to my question in the sense that part of what creates that moment is where we are. What role can African leadership play on the global stage to say, hang on, stop this madness?
Yeah. I think it's important that diplomacy is not isolated from everything else that we have in the ecosystem of a country. I'm excited when I see in South Africa and anywhere else in the world, business collaborating with government, so that the diplomacy of a country is the sum total of what everyone can offer. And then you delegate the one who's best positioned to present it. Because now, having been out of government for such a long time, being a go-go somewhere outside, I can see many missed opportunities that I could have used better if I know what I know now. It's important that there is no country and a diplomat of a country that sees themselves as representing all of us. They must represent all of us because they've spoken to us, everyone else, so that we can all contribute to enrich what they have to offer. Plus, I think it's important to interchange between government and private sector and civil society, because in addition to media, South Africa was saved by civil society, by the media, by the judiciary. All of those institutions are important. So it's important to give them that stature wherever diplomacy is being represented, because there's nothing that governments can offer that is not informed by the constituency across the board.
I'm going to go back to your point just a moment ago, if you'll allow me. We're talking here about a different narrative about ourselves. That moment in the Oval Office earlier on this year, where essentially our narrative was, yes, there has been misinformation and disinformation. We've only got a crime problem. How do we attract investment if that's the story we tell about ourselves? What might you have done in that moment?
So that moment was not as bad as it could have been, but was not as good as it could have been. And I think that it was unfortunate, I don't know, the nervousness or whatever, but too much said about crime. Because it's also strange that you have a country that has takes every moment of diplomacy to the media. It's not normal. You discuss with your colleagues in closed doors, and you pick on a moment where you just want to share what you have discussed. And not all of your interactions with foreigners have to be shared in any case. I guess they didn't share enough with the one other statesman. They treated him the way diplomacy is. But for everyone else, you have your whole diplomatic endeavor in front of everybody. I mean, what is that? What was the question? Hey, this thing of being old.
You were quite forceful in your view about let's not be beggars on the world stage.
Yeah.
And I'm saying we had that moment where the only or the strongest defense we made was how crime was afflicting us.
Yeah.
You were deputy president.
Yes, yes. You know
what
what?
would you have done?
I would have answered the questions that were not asked. Something that I've also learned with the media, that you must listen to what they ask, but you must go there with a deliberate agenda of your own, the things you want to say and have to say.
We saw that earlier.
But also because we did expect that we were going to be attacked.
Yeah.
All the reasons why we should have, when we were preparing, decided you will say this, you will say this, so that whatever happens, whatever they ask, you answer those questions, even if they don't ask them, especially because there was so much misinformation about South Africa, and we could have helped ourselves by just being firm on certain things that needed to be said. And also, not just for us, South Africa, also for Africa. Because if one of us wins on the continent, all of us win. It's always important for us to keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is worth a round of applause. I'm going to open the discussion for the floor, because I would imagine one or two of you might have questions for this esteemed panel. We've got microphones roving around the room. Could I see some hands if there are any questions? We've got our first one here. Please, can we pass a mic? If I can ask you to be as brief as you can, please. Thank you.
The question is about heroes. How do we define what is a hero? And the important reason for that is, how do we create an environment where our children and my age, my grandchildren, knows what kind of a story they want to write? We've written our stories. Some of them are love stories, and some of them are horror stories. But we need some definition of a hero, so that at least our children and grandchildren can look up to something while they're writing their stories.
Yeah.
Because that is the change that we need. If we 30 years ago started moving towards heroship, we would have been in a very different place than what we now.
Who wants to take that?
I can have a quick go. It's partly to push back. I mean, look, absolutely, kids need role models. That I think goes without saying. But I think something that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, you know, the danger of the single story. I think you can have multiple heroes and multiple narratives. You know, for some people, Nelson Mandela is an absolute hero. But there's a pushback against Nelson Mandela among some who think, you know, he handed over too much, he was too compliant, you know, that there was this moment in South African history that wasn't taken advantage of. That's fine. I think that's absolutely fine. We don't have to all agree. You know, take Winston Churchill in Britain. There are some people who hate Winston Churchill, think that he caused the famine in Calcutta, and some people think he saved the world. You know, I think, a society that's confident about itself can have multiple views of the same person and we can have a panoply of heroes who represent different things. So I would very slightly push back against that. And of course we can have heroines as well as heroes.
Can I push back against him?
Push back, please.
I really think that role models play a very important role. I've seen it with women, how women are able to remodel themselves differently when they've seen women doing something that they thought wasn't possible. I sort of agree with the question that we could have done more. People of my generation could have done more to be ever-present role model so that we have a variety, not just one, a variety of good imposing stories to leave behind for our children. I fear when I think that there are young people in South Africa who've never seen a clean city, who think that Joburg is just dirty. For instance, I mean, that's a light one, but those kinds of stories that really enforce and repeat what is good, even if you exaggerate. This is one place where we are allowed to exaggerate because we are doing it for the goodness of it. I see it in schools that I work with today. When I have a career day, the excitement and the knowledge that the children get about who they could be when they grow up, it is amazing. The value of role models has not been valued the way it should be. And people who are in this room, because you are role models, because you are in this small percentage of people on our continent who are making these positive changes, you have to be ever present in front of our children.
Great stuff. Any other question? Here we go.
Thank you. For us to take the global narrative home and talk to the people that are in our businesses, etc., from each five of you, Bongani, you included, what's the one word each of you is giving us to put into our narrative that we take home and talk about?
If I go first, I'll say institutions.
Probably not a word, but maybe a phrase. But show us examples of what these heroes look like.
Claim no easy victory. I think it's really important to make sure that we tell the hard stories, also to make sure that people know that victory isn't something that you attain easily. There will be hardships, but victory will be as well. Energy, agency, honesty. I could explain, but maybe those words will mean something.
Dr. Sami?
I'll quote my 4-year-old who always says, "Mommy, if you can imagine it, you can do it."
All right, perhaps one last question as we wrap up our session. Going once, going twice? All right, your concluding remarks. I'll start with you again, Dr. Same. A different story has to be told about Africa. In 3 words or in a sentence.
I think it starts with us reimagining a future that we would like to see, and I don't think we've done that quite honestly with ourselves. Like,
It
what can
starts with us.
Yeah.
All right, David?
Well, I would agree, and I use this phrase honesty. I mean, I think narratives are fantastic, but narratives have to be based on reality. If the narrative is wrong because the reality is wrong, then change the reality, and you can use the narrative to push for that.
Starts with us, change the reality.
Just being conscious that we are the ones that we've been waiting for, and then act like it. Really take the responsibility to be the one you've been waiting for. If you don't have integrity when others are not looking, that's not the one you've been waiting for. So be the one.
We are the ones we've been waiting for.
And I'd say African authenticity is a beautiful thing. Travel, talk to people, meet them, and you will be surprised by the potential and just breadth of this continent.
I think that was food for thought. A round of applause, please, for my panelists. Thank you very much to each of you. I think narratives aren't also about institutions. I think one of the things we've seen with the emergence of social media is that people around the world are telling each other stories about who they are. And I think it's a bright future. We'll take a 15-minute networking break, and then we'll have our final session for the day. Thank you.
Okay. And so, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Graveyard Shift. You know, I have the distinct privilege of chairing this session. And you know, when you start out in radio, it's usually at around 3 o'clock, I think, in the morning, or at midnight, you know, and you've got one listener or two listeners who are your faithful fans at that time who'll listen nonetheless. But at that time, of course, the majority are tuned out. It has been a very long day, a very informative and insightful day, so I won't take any offense at this present moment in time for the fact that your listening bundles may be depleted. I can't speak for the speakers because I know they would have prepared to come and present their cases to you and their presentation. But nonetheless, we will try and accelerate the discussion as quickly as possible, not mincing out or negating any of the important aspects of the conversation, of course. So we're wrapping up what has been a wonderful day with a discussion perhaps that ties it all together in terms of sectors. An argument that was made quite early on was the fact that collaboration will be key to achieving any goal, let alone unlocking the potential of a enormous continent with the combination, of course, of 1.3 billion people. And so the conversation is going to focus on sectors from technology, from energy, and manufacturing. In part, as we do look at how to achieve or how to implement multi-sector strategies to achieve excellence across the energy and also the economic stratosphere, as it were. So allow me to introduce you to the panelists who will be joining me in this discussion, beginning with Mr. James McKay. He's the CEO of the Energy Council of South Africa, driving the roadmap in part for a just and sustainable energy transition. James is here. Could I just also ask the speakers to ensure that they sit right by their picture? We don't want any misrepresentation of any speakers on stage. We do have Mr. Imran Moola as well, CEO of Sunny Sixt. Sunny Sixt, pioneer in smart mobility solutions, redefining how Africa moves. Mr. David Ndelwa, he moved. Okay, Mr. David Ndelwa, CEO of the Simba Group, scaling transformative businesses across energy, telecoms, and agriculture, as well as Mr. Bob Meng, Managing Director of Digital Power at Huawei, South Africa, forefront of deploying digital energy infrastructure across the region. And of course, gentlemen, you have me, because Bongani, being the lead MC of this conference, managed to avoid the graveyard shift, but I certainly look forward to hearing what you have to say. James, perhaps we begin with you when we do talk about energy right now. There's been a whole lot that has been said about energy, from the point that it is still lacking in its full capacity, with 600 million and then some Africans are still without access to reliable power. But we also heard from the CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa a little earlier about how much activity there has been in the private sector space, particularly when it comes to renewable energy, in participating further in this space. So how would you characterize what is going on in Africa's energy landscape right now, and anything that can be done to improve confidence in your view?
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think definitely there have been some very positive shifts. If we look at in the South Africa context, from 23 to where we are now, it's been quite a phenomenal ride, very positive. I recently participated in a World Energy Council International Advisory Group, and out of Europe, a bit of the narrative around Africa was actually that Africa's coming out of its paralysis. It is seen as attractive as investment, but investment is not integrated, it's not at speed, it's not at scale. So I think that the important reference here is global politics and geopolitics is hugely topsy-turvy with wars, trade wars, real wars going on. And in that context, what is happening in the energy space? Well, demand is actually consistently exponentially growing. EU is projecting a 60% electrification demand growth over the next 10 years based on transport and industrial pivots. China builds more wind and solar than the rest of the world combined every year. Global investment in clean tech tops $1.5 trillion a year. So in the Africa context, we just struggle with relevance. So I think I attended the earlier session on AI. I think this is also another issue where we talk about the 600 million Africans who don't have access to electricity. Yet AI is very rapidly becoming the next utility. And we also the professor spoke about sort of AI sovereignty and control of information. And yet AI is a huge consumer of needs cheap, baseload, reliable energy. So if we are already behind in terms of electricity and access, we are a rounding error in the global demand and pace of investment. We're not a leader in the clean tech space, and we're now facing a further wave that 90% of data centers are actually controlled through the US and China. South Africa is the only country that has a data center in Africa. So I think the pressure is on. We do have pockets of excellence. I think we've seen huge and rapid movement in South Africa, in East Africa, but what we've also heard and is relevant is we've got generation which is stranded in Africa because we don't have regional markets, interconnected grids are not available, and we have rather weak regulatory and kind of policy coherence space. So I think these are things that we have to deal with, and then I think that there clearly is huge demand upside potential for Africa if one takes the need to match the 600 million people plus the move into AI, which Africa will eventually get into. But we've got to move fast, and I think that's where the opportunity lies.
So I like your analogy in terms of we are coming out of paralysis. So there's a perception that we're coming out of paralysis. So when I think about that, what that looks like in terms of a physical human being, that physical human being won't necessarily just get up and start running or springing, jumping up and down, as it were. There will be steps that will need to be taken to develop that level of strength. So you mentioned a few areas of challenge, and I hear and I concur, but I suppose I put it back to you as well, in terms of the steps that can be taken towards absolute proficiency in walking the road, as it were, or running or springing up in this energy ecosystem.
Well, in South Africa, we've done incredibly well out from the load shedding crisis, which prompted a very collaborative, and there was earlier on we were talking about collaboration, I think, in your opening. We don't have the state institutions and capacity in the state to move at the pace and complexity required. So I would say the first thing we have to do is really capacitate the state, and I think that there's good international and donor appetite to support good regulations, good policy environment, and well-capacitated state institutions like our regulator, like our departments. The next thing is we just have to build a lot more grid. Now, again, we are competing with the rest of the world. The UK is targeting to build more grid in the next 5 years than they've built in the last 30 years. So we're not the only ones trying to build grid, and so this is going to, again, be competing for resources, for skills, for capital. But we've got to build a lot more grid, and we've got to be a lot quicker at it. And then the last thing is we do need markets. We have an affordability constraint across Africa. In South Africa, we're seeing this becoming a bigger and bigger societal challenge. We see municipal debt rising. Part of the way to address that is through markets. Markets forces transparency, competition, it drives efficiency, it creates price discovery in order to create investor confidence. So I think regional markets, we must move on those. In South Africa, we are targeting the launch of the wholesale energy market next year in April. I think it's progressing incredibly well, but there is a lot that needs to be done. We have a South African power pool. We need to link those up and create a Southern Africa wholesale market. If we can then create the regional connectors around grid, expand our grid, and then, I think expanding capacity in the state institutions, those are the building blocks that really will start moving towards success, which is speed and scale. We know what needs to be done, but achieving speed and scale is a real challenge.
Okay. We'll come back and add on to those points in the next round of questions. Imran, to bring it back to you just to speak about the automotive sector. Interesting sector, evolving sector. I think when you talk about it, specifically in the context of what is happening in Gauteng and the Tshwane Special Economic Zone, it's just one of those sectors that are in many parts heralded as success. There is an element of, in fact, a strong element that has of partnership that has been established between the public sector as well as the original equipment manufacturers, and there were plans, in my view, to do a little bit more. But how would you characterize the state of your sector right now and its ability right now to perhaps attract further investment and also activity within the players that are already in the market?
Yeah. First off, thank you very much, Standard Bank and everyone, for the invitation to be part of this panel. And I think any automotive manufacturer, when looking at a market, needs to first assess the demand and understanding whether South Africa or Africa can sustain more automotive manufacturers coming in. So let's look a bit backwards. In South Africa, last year alone, sold around 500,000 new vehicles in our market. And that accounts for around 50% of Africa's total sales. Now, to put that into a bit of context, the car park, that's the total number of vehicles operating, new or used, in South Africa, is around 10 million vehicles. Comparatively, South Africa, compared to Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, our 5 neighbors, collectively, their car park is around 1 million vehicles. So South Africa is much bigger, and South Africa sells, those countries combined sell around 30,000 new vehicles every year. But the biggest difference is that our automotive manufacturers in South Africa have a bit of protection, where a third party cannot import a vehicle into South Africa that's already homologated for our roads, whereas our neighbors don't have that protection. So you have the influx of used Japanese vehicles being sold into those markets, and it exceeds the amount of new vehicles sold in those countries, around 50,000 used Japanese compared to 30,000 new cars. So the demand in South Africa is there, and there's already a bit of an established network of dealers in South Africa. And then you have to look at the manufacturing and the infrastructural advantages of operating in South Africa and some of the logistics. South Africa already manufactures around 750,000 vehicles annually, and 250,000 are sold into the South African market, and 500,000 are exported. And these export plants come in 2 forms. You mentioned some in the Pretoria area. Those would be what we call a CKD, a complete knockdown facility, and then you get the SKD facilities, which are semi-knockdown facilities. So the likes of Hyundai and Mahindra would have an SKD facility that only assembles a kit of vehicles, and that's for their light commercial vehicles, and they get some exemptions on duties when they do that. But the bigger part is the CKD facilities. And there you have the bigger players, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota, VW, and Nissan, that manufactures that vehicle locally, and they try their best to source those components locally. And there you have the saving of the import duty complete. Now, that coupled with a relatively lower labor cost already makes it quite attractive for new automakers to come in. And then you have the logistics, which are our corridors that exist already, the Maputo corridor linking us to Mozambique, the Trans-Kalahari corridor linking South Africa to Namibia and Botswana, and the north-south linking to DRC via Zambia. So it's already quite established today. And then you already have the government playing their part in this entire process, where you have the APDP, the Automotive Production and Development Program, which incentivizes these global manufacturers to localize their production. But the result of all of this is that since 2018, our CKD manufacturers have invested a further 60 billion rand into existing infrastructure. So there is a winning formula, it's working, but you might ask then where's the opportunity? Why would a
Sure.
new player come in?
Sure.
And today already, of the 500,000 new vehicles sold, half of them, 250,000 vehicles, are imported out of China and India and manufactured there. Now, the reason for that is that those vehicles attract a lower income customer. They're on the lower end of the scale. And our CKD manufacturers today, Nissan builds the Navara, BMW builds the X3, Mercedes-Benz builds a C-Class. None of them have really gone into the right segment. They're building the higher end vehicles which get exported. So if these Chinese and Indian manufacturers can set up their facilities locally, saving on the import duties, they'll be able to have that 250,000 sales plus more, because you're going to now move into the new car sales as well and the used car vehicles. And it's already happening, right? You see Stellantis, it's a major European brand that represents European automotive brands and American.
There's a Porsche, I think.
No,
is under-
Stellantis represents Peugeot, Opel,
Peugeot.
GM, Citroën.
What's
and
their fast car? They've got a fast car.
Maserati.
There you go. Okay.
Yes. And they already are working with the IDC and a few Chinese brands already, the BAIC, SAIC, and Geely, to set up their manufacturing in South Africa. Whether it will be in the form of SKD, CKD, it's still to be seen, but it's already happening.
Sure. The question I wanted to say is that if, I think most people in the room would have traveled the continent, and what stands out to me when I do travel the continent is seeing makes of cars that are, first of all, quite old, and second of all, makes of cars that didn't even hit the South African market from my recollection. I know I tend to have a bad memory, but I am pretty sure that a lot of those makes, and I won't mention specific brands, never even hit South Africa. And I'm alluding to something that the industry is calling dumping of cars. And so you look at what's happening in the US right now, and the tariff that has been placed on the industry in the current administration's hopes and desires for a lot more manufacturing to be set up in the US. They're doing it via the tariff roof to encourage it. You spoke about what a player like Stellantis is doing right now, and you also spoke about the opportunity potentially for players in India and BRICS who serve a market that is not being served by the existing players who are manufacturing right now to perhaps do a little bit more here. So then my question to you, Imran, becomes what needs to happen to encourage such activity, to manufacturing activity of a lot more production in the automotive sector here, from a policy standpoint, from an incentive standpoint, because something tells me that the diplomatic approach of our administration is not going to, throw down the tariff hammer.
Yeah. I think before I get to South Africa, if you look at the region around South Africa, there has been attempts to set up these type of facilities in our neighboring countries. And it's never gotten to a point where it worked. Namibia has tried it, Botswana has tried it, and those facilities had to close down because there wasn't enough support from a government point of view. Now, South Africa, it's tried and tested. This has been operating for the last 20 or 30 years, manufacturing vehicles here already. And it's the Chinese movement is happening, whether we like it or not. The traditional brands, call it the older brands, they haven't been able to keep up with the South African demand. I mean, we heard it just now, the local pocket is under pressure. So I think this is going to happen naturally over time as we go along, because the Chinese and Indian manufacturers will see the demand, the opportunity, and need to localize some sort of manufacturing. And already we've seen the engagement of some of the Chinese brands to take over existing facilities that are under capacity in South Africa already. I think we might start seeing some JVs between different brands, but it's going to be difficult to see over the next couple of years what changes, because you mentioned these brands that you've never seen, if you've never heard of.
Yeah.
China has 150 local brands. We've only seen about 20. The Australian market has over 70 Chinese brands already. So some are backed by government, some are not. So it's still very early to see who's going to survive and who's not going to.
Sure.
But it's going to take a bit of time before we get to that stability.
Sure. And I mean, I think that what also stands out with the popularity of a lot of these Chinese and Indian car brands right now is the technology that is included within them, and the technology that they're able to offer to the client at a price point that is more agreeable with the pockets. And so, David, I want to talk to you about technology specifically and the integration of technology and data specifically in improving efficiency and scale production. Sir, how do you see it?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me as well on this panel and obviously contributing to one of these hot discussions that we should have when we're actually changing the narrative and to unlock Africa. Basically, when you're looking at agribusiness and production large, out of the population we're discussing in Africa of 1.3 billion people and the economy value of around $3 trillion, agri and its entire value chain, I believe I don't have the right percentage in terms of what it takes on the agri side, but it should be, I presume, should be more than 60% of the entire economy of Africa. So agriculture is actually very important, and the use of data and information and how these two can be integrated, it's quite critical. The good part of it is that we have a very young population in which we can adopt these methodologies, for example, in terms of more accurate farming technologies that are available at the global stage at the moment. Basically adopting what are the best practices that are happening elsewhere and then bring back in Africa and integrate it within our environment. In the afternoon session, we discussed a lot about AI and Internet of Things, how it can help to transform the agribusiness value chain to increase efficiency, as you have said. So what I see is that we should see this collaborative approach between the government sector and the private sector into enhancing these issues to the players at large, but also looking into other aspects like digital economy in terms of how can we now get information in terms of market information, availability of the market within the continent and outside of the continent. Digital infrastructures that are being discussed over the period of time here, how we can invest in that. I think this kind of information, and when they're being integrated or they're being used, it will largely impact and increase efficiency in production within Africa.
Okay, yeah. So added to that, so we have heard throughout the day about the importance of, accessing new markets, particularly new markets under the Africa Free Trade Area. And earlier on, with the opening discussion with John, who is trying to enable that to happen more easily with African countries using their own currencies to trade with one another, he mentioned some of the barriers that he could see anecdotally in terms of what was standing in the way of increasing further intra-Africa trade. It was access to markets, it was access to capital, and it was also access to data, amongst the few that he mentioned, although he did say that we've got quite a few problems. In your view, what are the key discussion points around intra-Africa trade and the barriers that need to be removed or unlocked to see a lot more traction in this area?
Good, interesting. When we heard about Africa Continent Free Trade Area and the approach that is being taken at the moment, there are key factors that we need to see basically that can accelerate what we need to do to facilitate intertrade within Africa. One of the key questions that I think, or challenge that you've mentioned, is the payment and settlement. At the moment, if I'm trading in Tanzania and in Zambia, I have to make within the two countries. We have to make a settlement using US dollars. It becomes one of the key challenges. So inter-Africa payment system that can happen, or gateway or integration between the different payment systems is actually very crucial. And one of the key issues I think we discussed, this other panels have discussed, is about how we're making settlements in these payments. How can we use our own local currencies to exchange and to be able to trade and to open the barriers? But also the other points that has to be addressed is on the regulatory frameworks. Still, Africa, we are talking about free trade area within ourselves, but we still have blocks that have different sort of policies that hinder such kind of facilitation of the trade. For example, whatever the East African Community is thinking and the SADC, you might find it very, very, very contradicting in one way or another. We have seen the issues of logistics and customs policies, or custom policies within member countries within Africa themselves. We are also not aligning to the key milestone that we need to achieve. We need to achieve to the 2030 ambitions of bringing Africa into one trade area in that aspect. So, key emphasis should be taken into opening the markets, thinking about borderless strategy and how we can enhance trade facilitation within member countries. I don't see much problem in terms of source of capital at the moment. But what I see, it's a main key issue is how that information are being transformed into the end users that needs to access that market.
Sure.
Yes.
I wonder if the reason why you don't see access to capital at the moment being a challenge is because you're in a room full of bankers with a very heavy balance sheet. But obviously, yeah, I know what you meant in the larger scheme of things. Bob, sir, thanks so much for your patience and bringing you in here. I think everyone is quite aware of the strides that Huawei has made, the significant strides that you've made both globally and here in South Africa. So maybe you can talk to us more specifically about how you see smart energy infrastructure being adapted more on the continent at scale to address some of our energy problems.
First of all, thank you for invitation. I do appreciate. And come again. You mean the smart AG?
Smart energy infrastructure. So.
Energy. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Actually, what we see is, as long the industry, the projects be implemented, the technology evolves. Those, how should I say, the latest technology, the proven ones would automatically be implemented.
Sure.
It's more about how you encourage, how you organize the market environment, and so foster more and more development. That way automatically, of course, everybody want to use the latest technology to enjoy the benefits, cost savings, better performance, such things. Yeah, so it's more about how you encourage more development. Yeah, and for South Africa market, we see it's quite a active and a mature market, and with the government encouragement, obviously with the policies to encourage more and more the renewable power projects, utility projects deployed, and also it's quite surprising and interesting that in this market, the majority of the sponsorship of the projects are coming from the commercial banks.
As opposed to what?
To sponsor those renewable projects.
I hear you. So you say it's quite interesting that the majority of that is coming
yeah,
from the
it's
commercial
compared
bank.
to other market. It's quite major. The developers, the stakeholders, they don't need to be too much concerned of sourcing funds. As long as it's a good project,
Okay.
the balance sheet is quite nice, so the funds are available. This is quite, how should I say, inspiring. Yeah, and then also you could find out that in this market, there are sufficient professional TA, technical advisor. They can provide a service from the inception to the conclusion of the project. For each stage, they can provide a professional service. So which would allow, no matter you are a traditional existing major IPP developer or you are just transit from other industry, these T's would allow you to run a project successfully.
Okay.
Yeah, so with all these conditions, with the government's encouragement, we can see more and more the supplier, like us OEMs, also the EPCs, the other international developers, they are all focusing, they pay attention to this market and coming.
Sure.
So we can see under this trend, well, the society is going to enjoy the new smart technology as time goes, yeah.
All right, fantastic. And that's fantastic in terms of I suppose, the positive feedback that you are giving about what the South African market is doing or getting right or relatively more right compared to its peers in the rest of the continent. But the argument that we're making or the discussion that we're having here is about how to unlock things further in other markets such that Huawei can participate more in solving for those solutions. So you said in terms of South Africa, it is an active government. It is an active commercial sector. And it's also, you mentioned technical advisors. So are you saying that with those 3 or so factors, if they had to be exported to other markets, the same level of participation from Huawei can be achieved? And is there anything else, perhaps, that you'd add to that list?
Well, it's just some ideas. We're not sure because for different market, different situation, the policies may be different, the demands may be different, the grid environment is also different.
Sure.
So you can't just fit in with 100% the same conditions. Some market that challenging could be difficult to source funding, but there are some reasons it's the funding's difficulty there, right? Some risks or what. I'm not professional in that part time, and also in some market there could be the grid is too weak to accommodate the renewables, yeah, then people have to rely on the traditional gensets or what, yeah. So,
okay.
To unlock, well, I think most important is maybe I think the banks may need to engage more with the government departments to how should I say, improve the policy support, yeah, and to how should I say, it's automatically it's business and also the social welfare. As long as the environment, the policy environment, the grid environment is stable, and there is a space for the developers to make a business there, automatically people will go there for sure.
Okay.
And some countries, the neighbor countries around South Africa, it's already happening like that, but not everyone. Yeah, so yeah, roughly it's like that.
No, it's a perfect rough summation, thank you. As I said, with the graveyard shift, there's now 1 or 2 very attentive listeners. And in fact, even at 3 o'clock or midnight sometimes, you'll actually have them call in to comment on a particular show. So I just want to know if we are amongst any in the room, in terms of any questions or comments that want to be added at this juncture. You guys are not loyal fans, it's okay. I'm not mad at you, but James has something to say. Go ahead.
I'd like to add something to that because I think it's important to reflect where we are in the maturity of our energy market development. As we said, we moved very positively coming out of sort of load shedding and with a lot of market reform. Financial close rate on renewable bills peaked end of last year. At the moment, grid constraints, market reform complexity, and what we're seeing is some policy incoherence. If we look at the Eskom pushback on traders and some of the discriminatory actions which are being challenged by NERSA, we're seeing quite a rapid decline in the rate of financial close. So it highlights we've had at this peak, what we don't want is a trough and a kind of downturn in the industry. The renewable industry is growing at the moment probably 30% year on year, and it's had a really aggressive, positive run, creating jobs, a lot of international investment, new builds sort of setting up shop. But what we really do now need to focus on is what you've referenced, is grid connectivity, expansion, policy coherence in the launch of the market next year. Otherwise, we will see quite a significant downturn in the renewables business or industry. And that is a concern.
Sure, and I think that this is the area of focus. We heard from the CEO of Eskom a little earlier, and he was talking about, the fact that the National Transmission Company of South Africa is very much aware that they need to put a lot more lines on the soil, as it were, to ensure that the energy-rich areas are able to supply the rest. He made reference to the fact that there's conversations about credit guarantees, and there is an ask for more government participation in terms of the standing as the last corner of protection, as it were. And I'm just interested in your thoughts as to what they are trying to do in their progress. It doesn't seem to sound as though you're as optimistic as I.
So the whole world is trying to expand very rapidly, as referenced earlier. We have good plans around policy frameworks. So I think, as Lungisa mentioned last night, we need action over inertia. It's also action over ambition.
Sure.
So we got plans. It's the implementation is stalling at the moment because it's tough, it's difficult. We're not getting the pace of development or in the transmission, expansion. As we launch the market next year, the bankers all need to shift gears. We're moving out of very traditional high debt components in investment, which has been referenced. As we move forward, we need hedges, contracts for difference, guarantees, futures markets. None of those currently exist. So the sustainability of investment in the energy sector, which is fundamental to security, economic growth, positive investor environment, and importantly, in the next 3 years, will Africa be in the AI game or not? We have got a lot of improvements in maturity in the ability to invest at speed and scale. And so particularly, it's the grid, it's the market formation, what goes with that investment, and then I think it comes back to also a well-capacitated regulator and ministry.
Okay, so sticking to the analogy of speed and things stalling and shifting gears, let's talk about what's happening in the EV market, because depending on where you look or depending on whose numbers you look at, there is a bit of stalling and there's a bit of shifting gears. By way of EVs in the African context and the adoption that perhaps is envisioned, we've seen the numbers slow and the uptake being relatively slow. Maybe you can talk to us about that and how you see that picture panning out.
Sure. I think before I get to the South African picture, if you take a step back and look at what's happening globally in the EV space, I mean, Europe or the EU had some very ambitious targets on an EV deadline, and that's all been shifted out now. Global automakers as well, they're starting over the last 6 to 12 months, they're rolling back on this EV strategy. And it's a very fast evolving situation at the moment when it comes to EV vehicles. And back to South Africa, we only have around 1,500 fully electric BEV, battery electric vehicles in our market. And alongside that, you only have 500 publicly available chargers. And not all 500 are high voltage, direct current DC, call it fast chargers. So the infrastructure is way behind where we need to be for the supply of vehicles that want to come into the South African market. And then our neighboring countries, the rest of the SADC countries, they are even further behind South Africa. And the other challenge you have is that, I mean, we've spoken about it quite a bit. South Africa has come out of this load shedding phase, this unreliable supply of power that gives customers the uncertainty around not having another solution of mobility if your vehicle cannot charge. And then South Africa or Africa is very different to Europe from a geographical point of view. Our cities are not like European cities that are close in close proximity. So it makes your route planning a little bit more difficult. I mean, the technology is evolving quite quickly. The range of a vehicle compared to 3 years ago has now almost tripled, in some cases quadrupled. So it's very quick at the rate the technology is growing. But it's not all bad, right? We've seen some good projects hitting the ground and working quite well. There's a few pilot projects in the urban areas where delivery vehicles and taxis where they have a home base and their range of travel is not very far. The EV strategy works. On some of the corridors we are seeing where there are solar-powered infrastructure being installed, that's starting to head in the right direction. And South Africa has recently created a bit of a tax incentive for new vehicle manufacturers that are building EV to try to incentivize the local production of electric vehicles. But if you had to ask me, I don't believe that 100% electric vehicles is the solution. Electricity will play a part of the solution, but on its own, in isolation, is a challenge. We've seen some automotive OEMs that have taken the stance where it has to be coupled with either ICE, internal combustion engine, or with another source of fuel energy to work together. So in this space, you're saying it's slowing down, yes, but I believe it's because of the uncertainty of what is the future. Battery technology is evolving very quickly, and OEMs and consumers locally haven't been able to find a solution for every South African need.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sure. Don't count on Tesla anytime soon.
No.
Coming to the African market. Or perhaps that's for other reasons as well. David, bringing it back to you as we do close out the food security question and discussion in agriculture. What role do you reckon the private sector can play that they're not presently playing in ensuring food security and sustainable, and building sustainable and profitable businesses?
Yeah, I think private sector, we are well positioned to drive innovation. I think that is one of the key issue in terms of improving the entire setup. But the next thing is access to markets. The private sector is well positioned into that space, whereby we can support the entire value chain to open access to the market. So this
regional
is
markets, are you talking about here?
So I think one of the key issues here, we have to discuss, first of all, how we can be able to trade within each other. So regionally, within African perspective, because over a period of years, I've seen it's a lot of intertrade within Africa ourselves, specifically in agriculture, presumably on the issue of food security. We have tried to also to make sure that we maintain our harvest within ourselves. We have seen that in Zambia. I've seen it now. I mean, last year when we have a huge problem of drought in Malawi, in Zambia, and part of Zimbabwe, whereby most of these countries, what they've tried to do was to try to find ways on how they can use their neighbors within Africa to make sure that we are also fixing the issue of food security. But that is only when the problem happens. But let's discuss about the food security is long term. So we have to see how we are legitimizing this agribusiness into a sector that does not only provide food security within the continent, but we also provide food security out of continent for in other areas where there is a need. And so private sector, the key roles, I said, is to make sure that we take initiatives to drive such kind of initiatives in an area of opening markets, making sure that the farmers are actually producing for ourselves and then can be able to get the markets.
Sure.
But also in terms of technology, we have been discussing today, in terms of value addition, access to storage facilities, cold supply chain, equipment and so forth, and bringing that technology or creating such technology within Africa for the purpose of producing more for ourselves and basically also for the purpose of expansion. Key issue also we can do is, what we are seeing is to support the agribusiness into driving agenda to the policymakers. The private sector now has much bigger role to take in terms of pushing the agenda to the policymakers and regulators, in terms of providing more friendlier regulatory frameworks within Africa. One of the gentlemen today from Botswana, I believe, he said, I think the politicians, one thing at least they should start thinking about is to stop thinking about borders and what works best for us within a specific country.
Wasn't that the president?
Sorry?
Wasn't that the president who said that?
I believe it's the vice
president.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, I was very moved by that, because what I'm seeing in so many of the countries where we operate as business people, first thing first is the politicians and who actually they are the one that play a big role into creating regulations and policies. They look at on a closed doors. They don't look how we can be able to open the borders and be able to do things that can support our entire African ecosystem on the agri side.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Point taken. Thanks so much. Bob, you have touched on this in terms of PPPs, the relationships and partnerships between the private sector and the public sector in deploying large-scale the green energy infrastructure specifically. So I think in wrapping up this conversation, I'll just ask you more on the private sector and the financiers' role in this regard. What, in your view, are some of the financing innovations that could accelerate project implementation across both rural and urban areas?
Sure. I'm not a professional. I don't have a financial background, so I may give some unprofessional descriptions of the thing. So, yeah. Currently, I mean, let's take South Africa market as an example. Currently, one of the major challenge the developers, the key stakeholders, also including the banks, the investors, are facing is there is a gap between the sponsor, I mean the banks, and also the developer. Why? Because the PPA, I mean the power purchase agreement, sometimes is not a long-term one, which will make the sponsor feel unsecured. But especially in the private sector. Yeah, the government projects, it's quite secured to have over 15 years, 20 years PPA. But in the commercial scenarios, normally 5 years, 7 years is take the majorities. Yeah, that's those for the short-term scenarios. And under such circumstances, the sponsors may feel, well, the project is designed for 20 years, over 20 years. But now only have a 7 years, let's say 8 years PPA. What if the demands are not there in the 9th, in the 10th year? How can I secure the money back? That things. Then,
sure.
Yeah. So roughly, currently, one is you have what do you call that? I'm not a professional. Your balance sheet can support. You have that what do you call mortgage thing, right, to support the loan security. Another one is you sign a loan agreement that to allow the sponsor to collect it back within 7 or maximum 10 years time. So they only have risks in 2 or 3 years. So any space for innovation to unlock such the problem, I would say maybe the sponsorship or the banks, or they can take other consultants from the TAs or from a similar role that can provide a very solid, sound analysis. Why? Because in this business, the nature is in the commercial, in the private sector, there's no possibility to sign a 20 years, a long-term PPA. So that's the business nature.
Okay.
Yeah, so which means this challenge will exist always.
Okay.
Then why not involve some professional team with, I don't know, through some legal, financial guarantees that can, based on their analysis, suggestions, then you could make a much more flexible loan agreement to sponsor those private sectors, the short-term PPA scenarios.
Okay.
That we will, I believe, that we will speed up a lot projects. We learned a lot of projects are on holding or slow down because of such things.
Okay. I think, notwithstanding your caveats, say you're not a professional in banking, I think that those ideas will be deemed as quite interesting ones to take further. So thanks so much for your intervention. So we are, as I said, about to wrap up. Any final thoughts from yourselves as the audience before, or you'll take the final thoughts to the networking session that will be taking place shortly after this? Shall we agree on that? Are you smiling? Is your smile saying yes? Okay, now you're nodding. Okay, I see you. Thank you. So I'm going to give the floor to you, and I think that essentially we are wrapping up the day as well as this discussion. And of course, we are here under the umbrella of unlocking Africa's true potential, resetting the narrative, multi-sector strategies to ensure that we achieve excellence across the energy and the economic stratospheres. If you can leave us with a sentence or two as a takeaway, as what would be, you know, an ingredient that you would add into the overall basket in doing so, it would be what? James, as an Afro enthusiast, just, you know, matched by your tie, sir. Although I see there's a lot of cultures going on in this outfit, but I'm going to take your tie, sir.
Thank you. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to just make a quick reference. The problem that you've stated is exactly why we need markets in Africa. So just in the South Africa context, we need to spend 2 trillion rand in the next 10 years, 1.3 trillion on new generation technology, 400 billion on transmission, 300 billion on distribution. We can't afford that on the country balance sheet, and the corporates can't afford that on their balance sheets either. That's why we have to have a market. So I think it's a very important point. That's what will give us that speed and scale. So coming back to what to me are really important signals and trends at the moment as a takeaway. Globally, I think we've seen, and we've referenced here, this pullback on the climate change narrative, led really by the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement. EU have pulled back on regulations. And the narrative at the moment is pragmatic and investment focused, and we hear this coming through. I think, you know, as a really interesting example, India have started talking about a green discount. So it's not a green premium, it's a green discount. And the green discount says they will only build wind and solar if it's a discount to fossil fuels. Yet they're second only to China in their rate of global build. I was at the Huawei conference last week with the South Africa CEO. They've got a battery now that can do 1,800 kilometers. The charge rate is under a second per kilometer. So it's innovation and technology is driving things now. It's not this narrative around climate change. We've seen a very direct defunding of lobby groups around climate change. Unfortunately, I think it's going to take a lot out of the research and skills, which is important. I'm less fussed about the lobby per se. But this narrative will change, and I think we've got a window of opportunity as Africa, as South Africa. We've got to be very focused on taking action. We've got to get these fundamentals in place. When the narrative changes again, I think what we'll see is a shift again in global capital. At the moment, there's been a big pullback. The US stop order, pullback in donor funding, lobby groups, that sort of narrative pressure. But that will come back, because at the moment it's just being driven by real practical investment. And what we see, that tipping point in that scale is there globally. But globally, that interest investment in that scale is going to turn and look at Africa, and we need to be ready.
Okay. Okay, be ahead of the curve when that change does happen. Thanks so much, James. James gave us a couple of paragraphs in closing. Feel free to give us a sentence, if you will.
Sure, I'll keep it short. But from an automotive point of view and establishing manufacturing in South Africa, I think the opportunity, the biggest opportunity for us in South Africa still is that our unemployment rate is very high. And incentivizing and bringing these automotive facilities into South Africa is definitely going to help with our unemployment in the long run and building our middle economy in South Africa. And that's, I think, the biggest key from our point of view. And obviously the added benefits that come with it and having these local manufacturing in South Africa is just a bonus.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, my closing remarks will go into the point of saying, let's move with what is happening in the world. Let's put Africa first. And if you're focusing on changing the narratives of Africa and to unlock Africa to its best potential, I think each sector, all sector must create some sort of interoperability. They should be able to talk to each other, from financial sector to manufacturing sector to technology sector and the likes. And let's focus on what works for us first. And we believe in the fact that it should start with us.
Absolutely. So we actually can steal a acronym from the book of the US administration and apply MAGA to ourselves as Africa as well. But Bob, a final word to you, sir, in terms of unlocking Africa's potential in the from the lens of Huawei. What would you say needs to be done?
Sure. Thank you for that. I would say, even though we mentioned those challenges, difficulties, however, there is a good, South Africa is in a good position, or let's say Africa continent is in a good position that in the power business, other countries like China, Singapore, Australia, UK, they are in, 10 years, 1 decade ahead. They already experienced some major issues already. So based on those experiences, we have quite sufficient reference, knowledge, and the new technology developments to address those things. So we are quite confident in this business for this market.
Oh, a wonderful and optimistic note to end. And of course, that's if we use and take the lessons from those who made the mistakes, who had the learnings before us. Many of us were told as young people to not touch the stove because it's hot. And then there was a curiosity to go and touch the stove and get burnt. But I think that it would be about ensuring that, with that call and with the template that they have shown us as to what doesn't work, in believing and not trying to disprove what's already been established. Ladies and gentlemen, with that said, I can officially say that the graveyard shift has come to an end. But I do think it has been an informative one. I think there is a saying that the graveyard is full of some of the best ideas that were never acted upon. Fortunately for us, we shifted the narrative a little bit in ensuring that we communicated these ideas, and it's up to us in terms of going forward to ensure that we implement. But thank you to all of you in the room as well as to the panel. Thank you so much for participating and for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry, so there's a lot of people leaving the room, and rightly so. Can I just also tell you where you can go, or where you need to be going right now? So we're taking, or the after party, as it were, of today's conference, and I think it's a well-deserved after party that will be complemented with a whole lot of sparkles and eatables to ignite further networking. It's taking place at Grub and Vine. You guys know where that is? Do you guys know? Well, those of you who don't know, don't worry, I also don't know. But they have, there's a lot of escorts around who will be able to escort you to where it is, and that's where the after party is going to be. So I hope I will see you there. It's really unwinding and reflecting on what has been said today, and then we will pick up again for tomorrow. So will I see you later and tomorrow? Is that a yes? Okay, thank you so much. See you later then.